Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining all of us today for the release of this report, very important report by the Task Force on U.S. Indo-Pacific Energy Strategy. I'm Paul Saunders. I'm the president of Energy Innovation Reform Project. We're the organization that sponsored the task force, and I also served as the task force director. And I'll say a few words before introducing our other speakers this morning. So Energy Innovation Reform Project is a nonpartisan organization, nonprofit. We work to advance U.S. energy innovation. And we convened this task force really because we were convinced, looking at the intersection of the global energy transition with escalating great power competition, that there are new challenges and also new opportunities for the United States, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, which is a region that's really at the center of the geopolitical rivalries, as well as at the center of the international economy. The report provides a thorough analysis of the energy transition, some of its key drivers, innovation, market conditions, policies to address climate change. It also describes U.S. competition with China and Russia, talks about our relations with our allies and partners in the region, and America's role in the Indo-Pacific energy systems. I think one of the core arguments in the report is the idea that energy technology competition is a key element in a wider technology competition, which in turn is a big part of the new global rivalries among the United States and our allies and also our competitors, and that we really need to do better as a country in this area that's going to define so much of our future prosperity and security. And the report concludes by presenting core principles for energy strategy and policy. It outlines what the group viewed as important interests and priorities that the United States should have or should keep in mind, and then shares 19 recommendations. Some of those recommendations are more in the line of general approaches, and others call for very specific actions. I think the last thing I would say is just how excited and humbled we were here at EIRP to be able to pull together such a distinguished group of individuals to serve on the task force. Former officials, members of Congress, experts, people from the private sector, a group with very diverse and deep experience in energy and energy technology. And I'm just so grateful to everyone in the group for all of their contributions to the final product. I'm especially grateful to the two co-chairs who, without whom we really couldn't have done any of this, and their leadership and hard work during the task force's meetings and the process of producing the report, it was really indispensable. So I'll now turn to our co-chairs, starting with Dan Poneman. As many know, he was Deputy Secretary of Energy from 2009 to 2014 after a distinguished career at the National Security Council and also in the private sector. He's returned to the private sector since then and is also a senior fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And Dan has decades of experience in the nuclear sector on both nuclear energy and security issues. So Dan, please.
Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yes.
Good. I want to thank you and the Energy Innovation Reform Project. You have done a phenomenal job at shepherding this project, and it was really your brainchild. So full credit to you for that. I also want to thank my friend and co-chair, Paula Dobriansky. I consider her both a dear friend as well as a good colleague, and I think we work very well on this project. And to just reiterate your thanks, I think the reason why the report came out so well, and I reread it again last night, and I really think it hangs together very well, is because of the great diverse set of views brought to the table by the task force members. And hopefully we'll be hearing from some of them individually. I know we'll be hearing from Senator Landrieu and Mike Green a little later. The first impression, and I'm only going to make a very few remarks, and Paul's going to return and give some of the high-level findings. So I'm just going to give a chapeau thinking about some of the broadest energy issues involved. But I think the first impression one gets just even looking at the map, and this is something that people know, but it's brought home graphically in the report, is just how important this region is to the world and all of the key issues that we're addressing in terms of energy, in terms of climate, in terms of global security. It has 2/3 of the world's economy, 2/3 of the world's energy production, and 70% of the energy consumption. So when it comes to questions of global economic growth and success in tackling climate, we will rise or fall on the basis of our success in this region as members of the region and in working with one another on tackling some of these challenges. I am not, in my very brief opening comments, going to address some of the critical diplomatic and security challenges we face. I will leave that to Paula with her deep expertise on that. But I will talk for just a couple of minutes here about the energy, technology, and innovation aspects of it. Energy is absolutely essential to the growth and prosperity of the region and indeed of the world. And as Bill Gates has recently argued in, I think, his very compelling book, that's a good thing. You know, we tend to start to worry about things and maybe we should curtail this and save that. But the fact of the matter is prosperity is linked to energy use. And so what we want to do is not curtail growth and curtail energy, but we want to learn how to do it better, faster, cheaper, and yes, of course, cleaner. And that's really the challenge before us. And especially what I think has to note in terms of justice and morality, you know, it would be kind of a harsh lesson if all of us got to the great levels of wealth that we've attained in the OECD world and then sort of pulled up the ladder after us and said, you can't grow the way we did because we've used up all the clean air and now you've got to conserve. So it's not a viable political path in addition to being very questionable morally. So how do we do that? How do we get there? Well, you know, there's a lot of answers that you'll see in this report. I'm just going to highlight a few. One is, you know, truly notable. Look, coal is obviously, in terms of power generation, still a very dominant fuel source. And especially in this region, look at China, look at India, look across ASEAN. Coal is and will be a very important source of energy throughout this region. There's no getting around that fact. And the fact is coal plants are continuing to be built and they're very young. And it's very hard to switch off a young asset that you've invested in. But LNG, which is written about a lot in this report, is actually a very powerful tool to help wean the region and the world off coal and help put us on the glide path to lower greenhouse gas emissions, because, of course, everyone knows natural gas only emits 1/2 of the greenhouse gas emissions compared to coal. And I think it's worth noting that not only is the advent of this market and the increasing flexibility of the market an asset to the economic growth of the region, but I think from a U.S. perspective, it's worth noting that the U.S. has really come on strong in this area, and that the fact that you have very powerful LNG export developing out of the United States means not only that you have greater opportunity for long-term sustainable supplies of cheap LNG relative to other fuel forms, but also, as I said, a very good way to wean the region off of excessive dependence on coal and bring you some the climatic benefit that go with it. But that's only one aspect of what needs to happen. As the report notes at the very opening, we are not, repeat, not on a glide path to meet the Paris Climate Agreement targets of 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise over pre-industrial levels. And we're not going to get there unless we throw every tool we've got against the problem. If you look at just questions such as how much building is happening in China, how much concrete is getting poured. Building efficiency is going to be incredibly important. And I would just like to flag, because I don't want to go on too long, we're going to have to do a lot better at innovating and technology generation in some specific areas. Number one, apropos my recent comments on coal and even natural gas, we will need to invest a lot more in carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, because since these fuel forms are going to continue for a long period of time, we're not going to wean people off of all of that. So the answer is we need to get the kind of economic CCUS technologies deployed so that those fuels can be used in a climate-friendly way. Number two, we need to do a lot better on energy storage. Prices have gone down a lot for lithium-ion batteries, but we're not talking about bridging a gap of an hour or two, but you might have to bridge days, weeks, or even seasons. And we aren't at all where we need to be in terms of affordable grid-level storage. And that, in turn, of course, is essential to backstopping the intermittent forms such as solar and wind. And to realize the full potential of the renewables, you really are going to need to do better on storage. Third, low carbon fuels. A lot of work has been done in this area, but obviously when it comes to decarbonizing the transportation sector, that's going to be important. And then finally, I do want to mention nuclear energy, which is frankly, according to the International Energy Agency, including according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, without a significant expansion of nuclear power, there's just no way we're going to get to net zero by mid-century, not even close. And in that respect, I think it's worth noting that there are a lot of new and exciting technologies out there, so-called fourth generation technologies. People like Bill Gates with TerraPower, X Energy are two companies that have won major awards in the United States, Department of Energy Advanced Reactor Development Program. And there are many more besides. Kairos has just announced an agreement with TVA to deploy a reactor there. So this new form of nuclear energy offers passively safe systems. They are smaller, better, more deployable, more affordable, and it could be a way not only to get the nuclear contribution that we need in a pure free carbon sense, but also, candidly speaking, to regain the public confidence in nuclear that was so badly damaged after the Fukushima accident, which of course affected a much earlier design of reactors going back decades. So nuclear, I think, is something where not only is there a strong energy play and a climate play, but from a U.S. national security standpoint, for the United States to continue to have the global influence it has always had on nonproliferation, we need to be out there in the market. And when the United States recovers its nuclear leadership, it's a good thing not only for clean energy, but also for our national security and promoting the strongest possible nonproliferation standards globally. Finally, I just want to say that the report, I think, also touches a number of very important things in terms of market design. Look, I think there's a strong support throughout the committee and the task force for market-based solutions wherever possible. When it comes to energy, it's never been a truly free market. So I think we will need to continue to look at the government as a regulator, as an investor, and frankly, as a purchaser of energy resources, not to displace commercial markets, but rather to enable them, enhance them, and to allow them eventually to take over. This is an experience we've had in the United States where the federal government used a loan guarantee program in 2009, 2010, and really launched in a very important way solar photovoltaic in the United States, car companies such as Tesla and so forth. And I think that is a model that can be repeated now as we're looking at a new infrastructure package in this country. And then finally, I would note that the human aspect of the equation is really important. And the report's recommendations in terms of student-to-student exchanges, in terms of science and technology fellowships and technology partnerships, I think are well worth reading. So with that, Paul, again, I want to thank you and the project for your sponsorship and leadership, and turn the microphone back to you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Again, really very grateful for your taking part in this exercise. So now I'll turn to Ambassador Paula Dobriansky. She was Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs from 2001 to 2009. after a career of service in many other important posts across the government, in the State Department, the National Security Council, and also at the former U.S. Information Agency. After leaving the Bush administration, she was Senior Vice President and Global Head of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Thomson Reuters. She's now Vice Chair of the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council, and like Dan, a Senior Fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. I feel like I should be on the payroll at the Belfer Center Communications Department. Paula has very extensive experience in the Indo-Pacific region, including as Undersecretary of State, founding and serving as the U.S. co-chair of the U.S.-China and U.S.-India Global Issues Fora. Paula, please.
Thank you so much, Paul. And let me join in immediately also in congratulating the Energy Innovation Reform Project and also you for your leadership. Truly, it was phenomenal in terms of not only your vision, but the way you carried this through. I too want to also say to my co-chair, Dan Poneman, who is a dear friend and also has been a wonderful co-chair. I also was very appreciative and welcome that opportunity to work together and collaborate with you yet again. And also something that Dan said that I believe strongly in, the strength of the report was not only derived from Paul's vision, but also the fact that the whole fabric of the task force itself, its members, were diverse, brought a lot of crucial expertise to the project. And for that, we're very gratified. And you will be hearing from Senator Landrieu, and you'll be hearing from also a dear friend, Dr. Mike Green, and hearing their perspectives, and looking forward to hearing other task force members. Something that the report really has highlighted right up front, and that is the fact that the Indo-Pacific region and America's role there will in many ways define the 21st century. And I think that this domain and an examination of this domain, the recommendations, the insights that are provided are absolutely timely and well warranted. And one of the aspects, of course, that's overarching here is the global energy transition and how that is taking place, and simultaneously the geopolitical competition in the region. And so the report really brings that together. And I think you're going to be hearing deep comments about how that nexus has evolved. Let me devote my two comments up front, or my comments up front, to two strands. One is the issue of the geopolitical competition broadly, globally, and no less in the region. And then also just the issue of the recommendation about the importance of regional diplomacy in the region. Clearly, the challenges that are posed by Russia and China are critical and impact this whole arena of energy and also economic relationships. I would say that the challenges posed by China are clearly political, they're economic, they're military. The Russian challenge is predominantly political, and it's military in its scale and scope. And in fact, the term disruptor has been used particularly in the case with Russia. I think here significantly, you can't look at this arena without looking at the fact that both countries have aligned themselves more closely, I would say within the last, roughly the last decade. They're politically aligned, particularly with a focus on the united goal of diminishing US power abroad, generally, and then specifically in the Indo-Pacific. Militarily and economically, it's very noteworthy when you look at the last 10 years in terms of the scale and the scope of the collaboration between Russia and China, the military exercises that have been held, the volume of trade that has gone back and forth. It certainly has increased. In the energy space, let me highlight and mention something that is worth remembering. After a 10-year or decade, virtually a decade-long negotiation, Russia and China had concluded a natural gas pipeline deal in 2014. And that culminated essentially in a 30-year deal that was worth about $400 billion in delivering gas to China. It was significant at the time, especially because it was also contrasted with the challenges that Russia in particular was facing in the European domain. The pipeline deal, I think, highlighted not just only this issue of looking at Europe, what's happening in the energy space, and looking at Asia and the Indo-Pacific, but it also highlighted truly the importance of the Asian markets and underscored also this very geopolitical competition that was and is afoot. Let me go to the second and the last piece that I'll just make in my brief opening comments, and that is the report does cite 3 priorities for regional diplomacy. And one is one that has been around for a while, but not a lot of importance originally was attached to that. And that's the quadrilateral security dialogue. The origins of it, Japanese Prime Minister Abe had announced its formation in 2007. And at that time, it was predominantly a military focused quad, which conducted military exercises, the Malabar exercises. And it certainly was and meant to be a quadrilateral counterweight, if you will, to the kinds of actions and aggressions put forth by China. Fast forward very significantly in the last administration, the Trump administration, the Quad was taken and there was the Indo-Pacific stripe that was put to it, but in particular, the Quad was raised and its meetings were raised to a ministerial level because there were years where the strength of the Quad had gone up and down for a variety of reasons. But suffice it to say that it was held at the ministerial level. Significantly, this administration, the Biden administration, has taken it, and now it has a head of state level. I think it underscores the very importance, as enunciated in the report, of regional diplomacy. And this is now not just about the military exercises. Significantly enough, last year, there was what constituted Quad Plus, where the 4 Quad countries came together with New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam, and for the purpose of discussing the pandemic and looking at economic supply chains. The reason for that was also a rethinking of manufacturing and supply chains, particularly in terms of critical industries. For example, the electronic industry. So I wanted to inject this in here because this aspect of regional diplomacy is important. It has ramifications not just for the original military space, but for the economic area and for supply chains going forward. Let me conclude my remarks by focusing on the other regional diplomacy. There were 3, and I want to mention a second one, which is India. India has been an important partner of the United States. I think back in the George W. Bush administration, when there was a declaration of the importance, a strategic importance attached to India. When I look at from there and across every administration, Republican and Democrat, it has been a premium placed on the strategic importance of India, politically, economically, and militarily, and no less in this domain of energy. The US Department of Energy has a strategic energy dialogue with India. And when you look at the scale and the scope of what's discussed, power and energy efficiency, oil and gas, renewable energies, sustainable development, and also research, technologies, innovation. So you can see the importance also of not just the relevance of India and its space for not only our report, but also for the recommendations set forth the report and the importance of regional diplomacy. With that, I will end there. And Paul, back to you, and just congratulations to you. It's been a real privilege to be part of this task force and this very important and timely effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. As in the case of Dan, very, very, very grateful for your taking part in this and all of the contributions that you've made. And I should also mention one item I neglected in introducing you, which is, of course, that you're a member of our board of directors. So thank you also for your service there. I will turn next to Senator Mary Landrieu. Senator Landrieu had planned to be with us this morning, but unfortunately was not able to be. She's contributed a very brief recorded statement for us, which my colleagues will now queue up and play for you.
Thank you, Paul, so much. It's been a pleasure to serve on this task force, particularly under the leadership of Paula and Dan, two experienced and very thoughtful leaders on this subject, and many others, of course. But this area of the world is so significantly important for many reasons. Trade, but this energy innovation opportunity is an extraordinary opportunity for the United States and this region. This final report that we're releasing addresses critical issues, including global energy transition and the increasing competitiveness of global environment. Both topics are preoccupying the administration and former members on Capitol Hill. I hope that they will find in this report some useful information and insights as they deliberate on the ways to engage and work with this region. Coming from Louisiana, I just have to say, just briefly, as a large gas producing state, that where gas can substitute for coal, we help the environment in a tremendous way and build alliances and strategic economic opportunities with allies like Japan and South Korea. So to make the most of these opportunities moving forward, many of which are outlined in this report, let us try to build as much bipartisan support as possible. Those changes, the most durable and lasting, and will benefit the United States and our alliances with this region for many years to come. Thank you all so much.
All right, we really appreciated Senator Landrieu taking part, and she really had a number of important insights during our sessions. So now I'll turn to our final speaker, Michael Green. He's Senior Vice President and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and actually, like our two co-chairs, also a veteran of the National Security Council staff, where he was Director of Asian Affairs and then later Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asia. And I expect all would agree that he's really one of Washington's top experts on the Indo-Pacific region and American policy there. So Mike, take it away.
Thanks very much, Paul, and congratulations to you and to EIRP for this task force report. The task force members were a really eclectic and fascinating mix of technologists and Asia experts, nuclear and LNG experts, and I learned a great deal. I really enjoyed, as I always do, being a part of any effort led by Paula Dobriansky and Dan Poneman. I worked for Paula at one point, thoroughly enjoyed it. I've never worked for Dan. I've long aspired to play in his rock band, but my instrument is the Scottish bagpipes, and we haven't worked out the repertoire. So this task force was the next best thing. So thanks for that also, Paul. We have known for some time that we cannot have a competition strategy with China in Asia without considering energy. And increasingly, we're realizing we can't have an energy strategy without considering geopolitical competition with China and with Russia. So this task force really hit right at the intersection of these two critical variables for the future of prosperity and security for the US and the world. The energy element in our China policy, we've never gotten quite right. There was a view a little over a decade ago that cooperation with China on this global challenge of climate change would somehow, and no one in our task force had this view, but you've heard this at the time quite a bit, that somehow we'd form a new model of great power relations, a new G2, a new cooperative formula with China. We'd focus on climate, which threatens the planet, and we'd get away from geopolitical tensions, Taiwan Strait, Japan, South China Sea. And it didn't work. And I think everyone recognizes that. And then in the last administration, we veered a little too far in the other direction. You know, the Trump administration pulled all the people in Beijing who were working on climate out, and we had nothing on dialogue with China on climate. So we've kind of swung, the pendulum has swung in two directions. It didn't work. And I think the task force points to that middle ground, which is essentially a strategy that builds on rulemaking in the Indo-Pacific with our allies and partners, but not to exclude China, instead to shape Chinese choices. China, after all, is the world's largest emitter and largest consumer of energy. And so we can have a geopolitical strategy without China, perhaps, but we can't have an energy strategy without China. So the swings of the pendulum, I think, are over. And I think we're now starting to recognize, and this is broadly on a bipartisan basis appreciated in Congress. It's the basis for the Biden administration strategy for Asia and the Indo-Pacific. We're going to have to build stronger partnerships with allies and partners, network them, and get into the business of rulemaking in this region, with the eventual effect, we hope and can expect, of beginning to shape some of China's choices, particularly with respect to energy policy, which affects all of us in the end. It's worth keeping in mind that we are not leading on rulemaking in the Indo-Pacific right now. The two largest trade agreements, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, the Trump administration pulled out of, and there's no indication yet the Biden administration is going to come back in. The other agreement, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, we're not in that either. So the two largest rulemaking efforts in this region, we're not in. And if we're concerned about Chinese revisionism and hegemonic aspirations, which we should be, we have to be in the rulemaking game. We can't cede the field. And energy is one area where we have very natural leadership tools and very obvious allies and partners we can work with. And that is a theme throughout this report. Dan mentioned nuclear and the opportunities with fourth gen. From a rulemaking perspective, do we want China to be writing the rules for nuclear safety? We don't. Nuclear energy has slowed for political reasons in the US, Korea, Japan, Taiwan. But there is no Chinese version of INPO, the industry association organization that sets standards on nuclear safety. There's nothing like that. So on nuclear, we need to be setting rules with allies and partners. On sustainable development, the shift from coal to LNG, we need to be setting the standards for that with our development policy, with our export policies, with our energy policies. Sustainable infrastructure as we compete with China's Belt and Road. Increasingly, we're going to be looking at energy-related infrastructure, including digital infrastructure. Critical minerals, which is an important part of the report, and access to those critical minerals and rules about access to those minerals. China has engaged in major export embargoes against Japan and other countries on rare earth metals, for example. So there's a whole set of rules that will shape geopolitics, that will shape climate policies, that will shape energy, where we need to be partnering with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, with India through the Quad. There is no set architecture in Asia. It's going to be eclectic and fluid, and we should pick the partnerships that work best. But at the core of every one of those is Japan, Korea, and Australia, and in many of them is India and ASEAN, which we touch on in the report. I just conclude by saying there's an opportunity there, but there's also a risk in how we are debating energy policy right now in our country. I am finding that one of the major concerns of allies like Japan and Australia right now about the new administration, which is generally getting good marks with the Quad, with the continuation of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and so forth. Two of the major concerns I tend to hear from our closest allies are, number one, about LNG. the administration, and this is not in the report, but I'm going to say it, the administration is sending very mixed signals on LNG. And LNG is absolutely essential for the future energy strategies of close allies like Japan, Korea, partners like Taiwan. And it's obviously, although they're a competitor, a critical export area for Australia. And the second one is infrastructure. We have built quietly, and the Trump administration deserves some credit for this, a strong partnership with Japan and Australia for the free and open Indo-Pacific infrastructure financing approach to compete with, or for an alternative to China's Belt and Road. Very effective, very effective. Real concerns that if that is now hijacked for the purpose of zero emissions infrastructure financing, all the effort that's been put in and a lot of money put in by Japan and Australia is going to have gone for naught. So we need to not only harness the opportunities we have with allies and partners, we need to be aware that if we don't get our own energy strategy and policy squared away at home, it's actually going to become an irritant and a problem with allies and partners. We won't only lose an opportunity, we'll actually find our overall strategy is suffering as a result. So thank you, Paul, and there. Look forward to the other panelists and task force members' comments.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your comments there, and also for taking part in the group. And you really contributed a great deal to our deliberations. So what I'd like to do here, and I'll try to do it very quickly because we've had a number of people speaking already. But what I'd like to do is just to give our listeners a little bit more of a concrete sense of some of the recommendations in the report. My colleagues, I think, will share a link to the report actually in the chat so that interested parties can log in and take a look at that. I, meanwhile, will just try to share my screen here. And hopefully I can show you a few things. So this is toward the end of the report, but as we start to set up our recommendations, one of the important things we try to do is to define some principles for U.S. strategy and U.S. policy. And I think you've heard a number of those principles already emerge in various ways during the discussion. Mike Green was just talking about kind of finding this right balance, between competing and cooperating, which we've described as, a principle of having positive goals and not focusing excessively on competitive aspects. Dan Poneman addressed also one of the principles, this idea that our policy should support and leverage markets, but also recognize that energy is just a very highly regulated sector. And Dan also brought up the idea that our policy should really be technology inclusive, that we should be looking at the whole range of technologies and not foreclosing options for ourselves or trying to foreclose them for our close allies and partners. And of course, our last principle here, which you've heard, I think, a number of times already, that policy should really be bipartisan. The next thing we do is to try to set out what do we think are U.S. interests and what should be U.S. priorities. I won't read through these interests. I've displayed them here on the screen. I think you can see that they range across a number of areas. I would certainly highlight, I guess, in the context of our current domestic political debates, that we do, as a bipartisan group, include supporting efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the region as a U.S. interest. Clearly, many of the other interests are very focused on, I guess, what I would call getting our own act together economically and in technology, and making sure that the United States is really in a position to lead. Then finally, we have a series of recommendations, and Paula Dobriansky touched briefly on our kind of three priorities for diplomacy, these three categories of countries: the Quad, our technologically advanced allies, and then India and ASEAN and other developing states in the region. And then, we get into policy recommendations, which we've divided into economic, security, and clean energy categories. And we've tried, as you can see here, perhaps actually to key the recommendations back to the interest through the use of these graphic icons. So in the case of economic recommendations, for example, I think one important one is the idea that we should try to launch a multilateral clean energy technology trade agreement. That's perhaps a little bit less ambitious than trying to get the United States back into the CPTPP trade agreement. But certainly could make a very important contribution. We've also got some recommendations here to promote U.S. exports of commercial nuclear power, which I think the group saw as quite as important. And as you've already heard, I think from others, to sustain and where possible to expand LNG exports, especially to our allies, and especially where LNG can replace coal. Looking at some of our security-oriented recommendations and really trying to fly through this, a number of them focus on critical minerals and really trying to get more coordination and cooperation among our allies and close partners in the region on critical minerals. There also is one other one here quite relevant in the context of our domestic situation in the United States here, leading cooperative regional efforts to assess and mitigate cybersecurity and other risks to our energy systems, something we've got to be very sensitive to after this week's attack on the Colonial Pipeline. Then finally, turning toward clean energy, and for us here at EIRP, this is really a central motivation for much of our work. We have recommendations really dramatically to increase federal investment in clean energy innovation, to work with our allies on joint financing, and to also, I guess, single out establishing a technology partnerships office at the State Department, something that's been proposed actually in a bill that's currently before the Congress. And here also some nuclear recommendations, helping the NRC to develop greater capacity to engage with regulators in the region, and even some potential changes to our domestic legislation that can facilitate investment by some of our allies in the United States, and to try to drive forward our nuclear innovation here. So let me stop there. We've taken a great deal of everyone's time. I'd like to open it up to questions. Please do submit questions that you have using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And I've got one here to start with, which I think is a very good question from Nicholas Gwozdev at the Naval War College. And Nick is asking about kind of these ambitions that we have in the context of our very partisan domestic political environment. Could I ask any or all of you to give a perspective on to what extent you feel that there could be bipartisan support in the administration, in Congress, for efforts like those that we're proposing here? Anybody want to volunteer? Or
I'll
Paula?
jump in.
Yeah.
I'll jump in because Nick, hi, I read your full question, so I'm going to extend a little bit of what Paul just put forward. I think first of all, because you asked, can we get away from great power competition in this, and can we really focus on technology and the growth of the economy? My answer is twofold. First, on the great power competition, just as you're very immersed in that issue, I think that that is something that will be with us. And by the way, on both sides of the aisle, I think there's a consensus of the importance of looking at that great power competition and how we deal with it. There are differences of approaches, but I think that's going to be with us. But secondly, let me tell you where I think there is a silver lining relevant to this report. And I'd be very interested in hearing Dan and Mike's views on this. I think actually relevant to technological innovation. I think that that's a space where, as connected to great power competition, that both sides of the aisle are focused on. Again, there may be different approaches, different emphases, as to how to go about it. But I do think there is that common base in looking at, and I mean here, not just energy, but the broad range of technological innovation that affects our economy, our growth, our security, our prosperity. So I think that's the key here, is the technological innovation. Dan, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm in strong agreement, Paula, with what you just said. And just to take the world I know best, the U.S. Department of Energy, I think it would be pretty challenging to find discrepancies of views in approach. When I left DOE, the science budget was about $5 billion. It got up to about $7 billion. And to your point, almost any and everything that we were focused on during my time at the department continued to be a focus. When I went to see Secretary Briette speak, we heard a lot of the same rhetoric, all of the above and so forth. Strong commitment to renewables, strong commitment to clean nuclear and CCUS and energy storage. So I think there is that. And I also think in terms of bipartisanship, I have certainly seen, not in a kind of zero-sum way exactly, but there is a pretty strong consensus that the United States does need to lead for economic reasons, for employment reasons, for trade reasons, but yeah, also, as Mike Green said, for national security reasons, safety reasons. Who do you want writing these codes, and in what language? And I don't think that's an R or D issue. I think there's a strong consensus in favor of that. And I think there's a sense that in some of these areas we've lost our way, but we do have an opportunity now to get it back. And again, I would just note in another area that I spent a lot of my time in, nuclear, you had two very strong bills supporting nuclear energy and advanced nuclear and safety regulations passed by wide bipartisan majorities. So I don't mean to be Pollyannish, but I think that there's, of course, at both extremes, there are people who don't sign up. But I think there's a pretty big center that is strongly bipartisan in nature, and to get us back where we need to be. And if you look at the polling data on the importance of climate and polling data on the importance of investment in innovation and technology, I think we have real opportunities. Challenges, yeah, absolutely. Partisanship, sure. But I've seen, I think, very promising signals in the last year and more that suggest that there is a space that we can make real progress.
Mike, would you like to add anything on that?
Well, partisanship's obviously a problem to any strategy on anything right now. Strategic competition with China is one of the, and working with allies, those are areas where there is very robust bipartisanship. The Endless Frontiers Act is working its way through the Senate right now. I think you'll find it has 60 or 70 co-sponsors. And this is more about the semiconductor industry and artificial intelligence and technology competition with China. So I could imagine a similar consensus behind some of the things talked about in this report. Something like a green trade deal. If you leave it to the extremes of both parties, nothing will happen. But if you have momentum for that behind, and I think you would have support from the AmCham, from industry, you'd have support from foreign policy leaders and trade experts. I think you'd get a lot of support from the environmental movement for a green trade deal, that, to lower tariffs on low emission products and so forth. So a lot of it's about building constituencies around these things. And I think what Dan said is right on a lot of the proposals in this report. There are very large constituencies in the middle that would come together around some of these. And then it's a question of leadership. And you've seen leadership on this Endless Frontiers Act, and I think you could see it on some other areas as well. Nuclear is the hardest politically, perhaps. There are big debates about climate, but there's middle grounds on all of these. If we see the kind of leadership we're seeing with the Endless Frontiers Act and some of the strategic competition related legislation right now.
Paul, if I might just add a footnote to what Mike just said. The last piece on the nuclear, there is contention there. That's why I thought it was really helpful on this report that we had Caroline Cochran, who's co-founder of Oklo. And I think you can see in the report an image of their Aurora unit, which shows you how different it is from the classic, big dome and cooling towers. One of the ways to, I think, find new common ground in a place like nuclear is with new technology, new innovation. And the prospect of a very small unit like that, addressing the needs of remote and remote communities that might not otherwise have access to energy at all. We know, vast numbers are still without electricity, which is a sad and even a tragic thing. So I agree with both Paula and Mike that I think there are real opportunities here. And I think that, as Mike said, this geostrategic competition aspect is actually been a quite powerful unifying theme across party lines.
Thank you, Dan. We have a question here in the Q&A from Anastasia Slivker relating to could we discuss initiatives or specific policies in the report related to the growth of battery storage? And perhaps if no one objects, I'll take that one first. And if any of you would like to add on, please do so. The report, I think, highlights in its analytical discussion, on one hand, kind of how just the enormous progress that's been made with batteries and what a difference that's made, in our economy and society as batteries have become smaller, more powerful, and cheaper. But at the same time, I think it rather starkly presents how far there is yet to go if battery storage is to be really a meaningful part of grid level solutions. And speaking strictly for myself there, I think there are just some really great challenges to that because, and Dan touched on this, it's one thing to balance variable renewable power over the course of a single day or perhaps a couple of days. But if you have a stretch of 8-10 days of low generation, much less the difference between seasons, it's very challenging to see how that will scale up. But in any event, in the report, we don't really address kind of battery technology recommendations specifically. There's more, I think, a recommendation that that's an area to work with our technologically advanced allies in the region on R&D. And it's certainly also an area that drives a lot of the growing concern about critical minerals that Mike Green touched upon. But if anyone else on the panel here has a comment on that, please jump in.
Paul, I just make two very quick comments. It's a great question. And the first comment is kind of an analytical one, which is there is been tremendous progress, as the report notes, in the reduction of the levelized cost of electricity for wind and solar. But that does not take into account all of the vast costs for storage and transmission that go along with it. And so really for those intermittent forms of power to realize their full potential, we just need to do much better, I'd say exponentially better in terms of batteries. There's a great book called Taming the Sun by Varun Sivaram, formerly of the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, now a senior advisor to climate czar Kerry, our negotiator. And he shows you that to get the full maximum benefit out of solar especially, you need to have just much more grid level storage that can tide you over, as Paul said, seasonal kinds of variations. The second thing is, this is a place where there is a lot of incentive and there are reasons for private sector investment, and you've seen Tesla and others do that. But this is really an area where I do think there's a lot of potentially high payoff, but long-term technology development. So if one were looking, as been often advocated by Bill Gates and others, for places to put governmental resources in long-term research and even basic research, I think energy storage is very high on the list.
Thank you very much for that, Dan. So we're about 3 minutes away here from our scheduled end time. Perhaps if each of you have kind of a minute of final thoughts, maybe starting with Mike, then Dan, and then Paula will give you the last word.
Well, again, thank you, Paul and Paul and Dan. The report's very, very rich, and it offers a menu both for energy wala and Asia wala. I mean, for experts in both. I guess the only thing I would say is I hope that the administration and the Congress take this on. I think they will take on a lot of the recommendations. It's rare that a report like this gets swallowed wholesale and implemented by government, but I think a lot of these recommendations are going to resonate. And resonate with more than one part of the government and the Congress, by the way. There are multiple constituencies will get behind these. And this is sort of beyond our remit, but I do hope that there's a consultative process with allies and partners. I keep talking about it, but we are in a multipolar Asia and a multipolar world increasingly. We know that we don't have enough heft alone to deal with the challenges we have from China, the geopolitical security challenges, but also the enormous consequences of China's energy consumption and rapidly rising emissions. We can't do it alone. We have to do it with allies and partners. And I think we ought to take this report on the road a little bit and use it to try to generate some strategic ideas and consultations with Japan and Korea and Australia and India and Canada and others. Because if we can't do it alone, then we can't think of it alone. It's got to be an iterative consultative process with allies, which historically we're not great at as a country. But there's a lot in this report that allies and partners will also want to jump on and use, so we can build from the bottom up with our partners and approach to the problems in the report.
Thank you so much, Mike. Dan.
So I would just really follow directly on from Mike. It is a rich smorgasbord, a rich menu, as Mike said. There's a lot of there. It's very, very substantive. To me, maybe as an old Washingtonian, I think the process was as important as the substance, in the sense that you had, really robust debates and not all shared viewpoints, but coming together on a really, I think, strong report. And again, I agree with Mike. I think it's the beginning of the conversation, hopefully not the end. And to Nick's point in the question, look, none of these policies will work if they don't sustain bipartisan support, because we're talking about multi-decadal investments. And nobody's going to make a multi-decadal investment if you think it's going to get flipped in 2 years or 4 years. So, we have to be bipartisan or we will fail. And to Mike's point, which I'm glad he keeps drilling down on, it's also not just the US. It's got to be embraced by and supported by allies. Having been in a lot of those clean energy ministerials back in my time in government, I think you're going to find a lot of traction with the substance of this, but it's got to start right here at home. And Paul, I guess we'll really look to you to help, take this on the road and get into the meetings with stakeholders in government and out of government who can help, propagate the message. And, I'm also not thinking we'll get the whole thing enacted in the, single legislative vehicle, but I do think that there's a lot that will be pulled out of here and that can be leveraged to make real contributions to a safer, more secure, and cleaner world.
Paula.
Thanks, Paul. I will end as I began. The Indo-Pacific region and America's role there will in many ways define the 21st century. I think the report has really underscored the significance of the region. And I think the silver lining here is that you have an executive branch, a congressional branch, the think tank community. So let me say the nonprofit and profit communities all focused on this region. It's timely. So Paul, when are we taking it on the road? Back to you.
Thank you very much, Paula. We will certainly be doing our best over here to make that happen. And thank you also to Dan and to Mike for taking part in the session this morning. We had one question come in here at the last minute, which regrettably I don't think we can answer, but just because of the time constraint. But I would highlight it as a very important question, which is kind of the challenges for many of our allies as the United States starts thinking more and more about supply chains. And many of our allies like us are relying on materials and components from China, which they in turn, may assemble and sell in the United States. Big question and challenge for us moving forward. And thank you, Chin-Ho Park, for raising that question. I'm sorry that we're out of time and can't address it this morning. So thank you to all for taking part. Thank you to our audience for listening, and we hope that this will not be the last you hear of us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.